Hey, Lauren Hughes here with Integrity Home Group and Keller Williams Preferred. We are in our investment story series, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my first introduction to finance. And this is coming from a perspective of I think I started doing these finance money exercises when I was 5 or 6 years old. My grandfather used to have chores for me, and he was the only adult that really would talk money with me or talk to me like I was not a 5 or 6 year old. So maybe most of it probably went over my head and I didn't grasp much of it. But I want to tell you about some of the things that I did grasp when I was very young. And I got an introduction to finance and maybe more wealth building, and got it at a young age. And it's something that I never learned in schools. I've actually never learned from any of my other parents or family. No one seems to ever want to talk about money. And he was one of the ones that would actually talk about money and told me that I needed to be comfortable talking about money if I ever wanted to have it. So there it is. And that's one of the reasons why I keep these coin jars in my house still, even though I rarely use money. I always have my buckets of money, and that brings me back to when I was younger, and I would sit there with my grandfather and we would sort the big, like 5-gallon jugs that you can still get water in them, but a lot of people used to keep pennies and coins in there. And my in-laws in Chicago still have Minnie, which my 3-year-old tries to dump out every time he goes over there. And so that was one of my first introduction to money and talking about money. And one of the exercises I would do is I would just count pennies. He would have me count pennies, put them in stacks of 10, just over and over and over and over again. And I would do this for hours. But before I could stack them, I had to divide them into 2 piles. One pile, I believe, I don't know the dates. He would have me divide the pennies based on the dates. And I started doing this to date myself. I started doing this in the 80s and the early 90s. And we were looking for wheat pennies. And I've talked about this before. And I actually went through this entire jar. There's no wheat pennies, but it's also 30 years since I've done this. So time flies. And so the reason why we were doing that is because we were looking for wheat pennies, or then pennies we had in the 40s, I believe 44 and 45. He had specific dates because we were sorting out the pennies that were made with different metals. And the wheat pennies, which they had 2 wheat, pictures of wheat on the back of them. That's why we called them that. And they were made with 2 cents of material instead of the 1 cent that a penny is. So I remember just doing that for hours and hours, and we would separate the pennies, and I believe it was 44 and 45. It had sometime during a wartime, we were looking at those pennies too, because they were actually worth more because of the material that was in them. Anyway, talk about nitty gritty. That's what we were doing, and he would talk to me about the U.S. banking system a little bit, most of which I had no idea what on earth he was talking about. And he talked a lot about Nixon taking the U.S. off the gold standard, and he did not like that. And I learned about just he had lots of opinions about it. It was, I would say, apolitical, but he did not like that the government took the U.S. off the gold standard. And he has a very similar opinion to Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad series, where he actually talks about the gold standard. And then I just finished a behemoth of a book, and the book wasn't very long. The amount of knowledge was massive, and it was called The Great Deformation, and that was by David Allen Stockman. And that talks about, finance in the United States, and we don't need to go on that long diatribe that is the government and money. But I just wanted to briefly tell you about how I got into finding investments, and it started with coins. Nowadays you can do that with nickels, because nickels are worth more than the 5 cents that they're printed on. But starting big or small, it doesn't matter where you start as long as you start. So thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.